So I'm here with Tariq. Tariq, you've been a wonderful partner of Gravity AI, and it's been absolutely my pleasure to have gotten to know you over the last year. Would you mind doing a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure, fantastic. It's great to be here, and it's great to be having this sort of virtual fireside chat. I guess I've worked in technology for about 25 years, and over that time, I've seen what works and what doesn't work and the various trends. And as part of my own kind of growth and maturing, I became really conscious of how the digital systems, the digital services and products that we design impact people either individually or at scale. And that's through the eyes of a startup or larger organizations like banks. And over the last 10 years in central government in the UK. And as you can imagine, government develops services, some of which are pretty essential for people's livelihoods, health and safety as well.
Mm.
And then I've become focused much more on the new kinds of issues and risks that have emerged through the use of data, learning from data, and automating through the use of sophisticated algorithms, whether we call them machine learning or AI. And I think that's something that more of us are becoming aware of and asking good questions about. How safe are these systems? How fair are they? How ethical are they? And we can dive into what that means.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's where I am today. And I'm lucky enough today to be very much focused on that specific question and helping organizations understand what those risks are and
Yeah,
what they can do about them.
wonderful. You know, it is good to be able to take enjoyment in this field. It almost feels like I shouldn't be as fascinated with it. Like it feels wrong, but it is just fascinating what's emerging. And I think one of the reasons that I almost have that guilt around it is it's extremely important, right? And these are we're talking about potentially dangerous or unethical things, but there's a level of academic curiosity that I have about this, that it is just a very, very interesting field because of it's changing so fast, and because of a lot of the ambiguity and uncertainty around some of this. It just fuels that fascination in me.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think, I feel a little bit that myself because growing up, we grew up in a world where AI was, science fiction almost, and the ability for robots and AI to do to think and to do things that we could only dream of. More and more of that is becoming reality. We're very close to cars being able to drive,
Yeah.
to do. They already can do medical diagnosis. Some of the conversations that can be automated through, for example, GPT-3 are highly realistic. And so the progress is fantastic. New kinds of capabilities have emerged. So, a few years ago in the news was the announcement that AI could play the game of Go, which, although
Mhm.
the rules are very simple, the complexity of the game and sophistication is quite high, and it's actually harder to teach a computer to play Go than it is to play chess, which, in comparison, is very narrow in how the game proceeds. And actually, through the use of these new techniques, new strategies were developed and discovered, which humans hadn't done in 3,000 years of playing the game.
Wow.
And so there's some def. I know there's a lot of hype around AI, but that within that hype, there's some definite real progress. So that's to be celebrated, and we should use that and embrace it, because that is the future. But we should also do that mindful of the risks that come with that. In our enthusiasm, we don't want to end up damaging or hurting people or being unfair to people.
Yeah.
And I think there's lots of parallels between what's happening in AI and what happened 20, 30, 40 years ago in the field of information security, where people were, again, very enthusiastic about the kinds of exploits that you could develop or discover, and hacking them and
Yeah.
exploiting them, and it was quite glamorous. But that quickly morphed into and matured into a discipline which has a lot of consensus around how it should be done, a risk-based approach, and the roles of people have become clearer, what the profession is, what the disciplines are, and again around the regulatory oversight of that. What is it that an organization needs to have demonstrated? That's proportionate as well. So it's worth looking over that and saying, well, what can we learn? And I'm pleased to say that people are starting to learn, but it's also worth recognizing that we're in that early storming, forming, hype, kind of phase where there's lots of excitement, a lot of ambiguity, and sometimes not a lot of clarity. But I always say to people, we aren't the first to have done this. If you look at information security, if you look at some of the older engineering disciplines, the vintage ones like civil engineering, building things, we've been doing that for thousands of years, and we know how to demonstrate how safe those things are. Bridges, buildings, we start to understand the materials, we test them, we productionize that, and then we get good at it. So we only do interesting things when we are doing innovative building designs, for example. So there's a nice mix of commoditized production civil engineering, as well as very interesting new. So we can learn a lot from that as well. We can also talk about the black box issue as well, and there's some parallels with medicine there as well, because medicines, the effects of medicines on people isn't 100% deterministic. They will have effects on people which we can't explain. But over the centuries, we've developed an understanding of how to reassure ourselves. So the black box issue isn't unique to AI.
No, not at all.
So I try to bring people back down to earth.
It's so interesting because we did. There are so many parallels to the safety industries that have arisen for these very well-known segments, right? And there's a whole safety industry for, as you said, construction, a whole safety industry in the medical field and well-known practices. And in some cases, as you pointed out, some of that has existed for thousands of years, or at least has had a long history to develop. I feel that the speed with which we're developing that safety industry for the world of AI is much faster than those, because of the learnings that we can take from the previous industries, as you mentioned. And I think that your analogy in the security comparison is very apt, right? A lot of excitement and a lot of hype cycle around it. And the same, there are lessons to be learned from that. And I feel like we're taking in those lessons faster, and it's happening faster for AI. That's my perception. Would you say that it's maturing faster because of these previous lessons, or does it feel like we're still slow?
I think it's mixed, and I'll explain why I think it's mixed. What we've seen in the maturing of this field of AI and the discussion of the questions around the new kinds of risks is a conversation that is led by academia, and particularly academics who focus on philosophy, ethics as a classical subject. And unfortunately, those discussions don't easily translate into practical advice for people who are just busy and want to build things and build them safely. I don't want
to pick on academia, but that is often the case with academia.
it is, yeah. But we did quite see that with say the kind of the maturing of information security. We didn't really have philosophical debates about what is security. We have what is ethics. Although we do have a little bit of that with medicine, but we kind of got over that. So I think we've allowed academia and the philosophical thinkers to lead the debate, and we need to kind of get into that room as well. it's absolutely important that they do, because these questions are very human in nature. When we make decisions, automated or otherwise, that impact people, either individuals, communities, entire societies, we do need to think about those questions through the lens of the humanities, because these are very human questions.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't just allow technologists to make those decisions. On the other hand, it's not very useful what's coming out of academia in terms of practical guidance.
Mm.
And so some of us really have tried to counter that, not to negate it, but to kind of get into the same room and say, look, we need to provide clarity and practical advice on what organizations and busy professionals, technologists, data scientists, what they can do and how they should think about these questions. And luckily, as we said earlier, there are patterns that already exist in engineering disciplines, information security. I think organizations don't need to tie themselves into knots worrying about what ethics is. If they can get 80% of the issues right, they're very, very far along the way of being responsible developers of this
Sure.
technology. If you take a look at the kinds of things that have gone wrong and get reported in the news, none of those issues had a poor understanding of the history of the philosophy of ethics. The issues with bad testing.
Right. The issues were of a technical nature, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
In many cases.
Just the basic 101.
Yeah. This is super interesting. I am I'm very much in agreement that it shouldn't entirely fall these discussions on the technical team. I remember seeing posts like on towardsdatascience.com and a lot of other popular data science sites talking about how data scientists need to become experts in design thinking. And it was almost, trust me, this will tie back into ethics, but I remember seeing that and saying, oh, you mean us who have dedicated our life to the practice of design thinking, like, oh no, just data scientists, you just be, in addition to your PhD, you just need to be all these other things, including brilliant designers. And I remember thinking that's discounts the decades of work that I put into understanding product management and design thinking. Oh, just make the data scientists experts in that too. And I similarly feel that there's this pressure on data scientists to be ethicists. And I teach this course occasionally called AI for Product Managers, and we talk a lot about ethics. There's aspects that 100% fall in the technical realm. Did you test this correctly? Is there known algorithmic bias in your data, or other technical aspects of this? But there are many other questions that are being thrust upon the data science community that do fall in the philosophy of ethics. And I feel like we're almost discounting, again, like the years of work that went, like, so there's an ethicist somewhere who's like, I've dedicated my life to this, and you can't just have someone become an expert in this. I always recommend, like, consult an AI ethicist, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we can agree there is in a team or in an organization, somebody needs to be owning these questions.
Yes.
I think where we are in terms of maturing at the moment, most organizations haven't recruited somebody who's a design thinker, somebody who's a responsible product owner, or if they have, they're not thinking about the second order effects, for example, of the product. They're probably thinking about features and functionality.
Yeah.
So it's automatic then to say, well, surely the data scientist should be thinking about this. And I think it's a case of just that part of the evolution where, because organizations haven't got that capability, it's going to fall on the development team to do that. But it shouldn't have to, because a data scientist is going to be good at data science, and we shouldn't overload everything else onto that role.
Yeah.
But I think as organizations mature, particularly if they are developing services which could harm people, there is a case then for investing proportionately in the right skills and the right expertise. And I often show a little chart which shows risk and then investment. So if the risk or the impact is high, you really should be investing in people and skills to make sure that you're developing something that is safe. And that makes sense, and that's what we do when we do information security. If our systems in terms of information security, if the worst that can happen is, maybe somebody is robbed of sort of $3 or $4 or pounds or the wrong flowers are ordered,
right?
That's a scale that isn't very large. But on the other hand, if the entire organization sort of customer base and the bank details are taken, or their medical history is exposed or subverted, then that's dangerous. And clearly an organization can see the need for investing in a range of skills and expertises to make sure that those services are safe and secure, and there's the ability to explain to shareholders, to the board, to regulators, why and how they are safe. The same thing will happen with AI. We're just finding our way there. But you raise an absolutely important point there around the default kind of knee-jerk reaction of throwing all these responsibilities onto developers. But on the other hand, I think most data scientists and technologists are starting to understand that they don't operate in a neutral space. Yes, there are people who are very, very enthusiastic and expert in deep technology, but actually most technologists do understand that what they are developing exists in a context.
Definitely.
And they whether they think a lot or a little about it, they do recognize that the technology that they're developing is being used by people or on people. and they have a view on that, and I've been really pleased to see that some organizations have had action taken by employees.
Yeah.
When the technologists say, look, we're not happy with how you're using this technology, particularly in the social media space, where organizations I think can take more care about how the negative effects of that technology.
Very topical right now, and obviously in the present, given the recent whistleblower from Facebook, among other things, and the 60 Minutes interview that she did. Fascinating. I like the way that people phrased that conversation that she had. No one was surprised by what she said. I think we all kind of suspected that was the case. So not to go on a tangent about that particular instance, but it is a very good illustration. You're right about that. There are individuals within the organizations that are technologists who do have a sense of ownership of the consequences of trying to think through those consequences. I think where I worry that there's a disconnect is in the instances where there's, no matter the good intentions or the knowledge base of that developer team, there is going to be potentially skill/knowledge that is outside the realm of their expertise that they might have a blind spot on. And I think that's where I get concerned.
Yeah. And I think without sounding like there's an answer to everything, we can sometimes, yes, we are in a new space, and it can feel like we have to discover the new answers to new questions. But actually, surprisingly often, the answers exist in parallel industries. Again, going back to information security, if you're developing a service or a system which has high impact, it is normal practice and uncontroversial to say there might have been groupthink in the team, or we might have overlooked something. It is standard practice to then have outside second opinions to assess what you've built, an independent perspective. And in some sectors, that's actually regulatory. Those things are mandated by government in some specific cases, but all of it is in proportion to the impact of things going wrong. And I think the same. We should take some lessons there. I think tying this back into the social media example, some organizations do unfortunately use ethics boards and oversight boards as a marketing effort,
Sure.
unfortunately. And some don't. They want it to work, but it can't work because of conflict of interest. And I think what that raises is a very interesting question of, to what extent does society or government um, regulate or mandate um, the kinds of automation that a company does? And I think that's where we are now at this point in history. We're at that point now where we've had a few years now of seeing some of the negative effects that
Yeah.
have gone unregulated, and society is asking itself, do we want to regulate this? Will it impact innovation? Will it slow things down? Will all the innovation go overseas to, say, China or elsewhere, if we do it too much? And that's an ongoing,
Yeah.
discussion,
Yeah.
and I'm pleased it's happening. I'm really pleased, and I've been surprised actually in a positive way. 20 years ago, many of us were trying to raise the issue of privacy.
Yeah.
That was a big kind of issue, and unfortunately, we weren't getting quite the traction with the public. I'm pleased to see this time round, the public seem to care a lot more. They don't want um, a tyranny of automation about
Right.
their life chances. Um, they know their organizations have information about them, and they seem to be at ease with that. But I think they seem to care and get agitated when that information is used badly and
Certainly.
it affects them. And I'm pleased that that's happening. So this time around, there is a lot more public demand for quality and assurance, and I think that's what's been driving regulation. So
Yeah.
I'm really pleased that society itself is asking these questions, um, and it comes down to a very fundamental question. It's going to sound philosophical. It is about what kind of society do we want to be.
Yeah.
Um, you know,
Yeah.
and I think that's a very big question, but a very healthy question for us to be engaged in.
Yeah.
But exactly, technology is that sector which is defining our future. Is all the way we live our lives is increasingly technological, and what we might have thought of as the nuts and bolts of TCP/IP or Web VNC or whatever these technologies, they are very closely involved in products and services which define how we live and how we think and how we act democratically as citizens in democracies.
Yeah.
So it is really important how we kind of govern those and decide what is the future of the society we want to be.
Yeah. It's very interesting because the privacy debate, right? As you mentioned, there were no visible consequences for so long for the individual citizen of how your data was being used, maybe some targeted advertising. And for the most part, the public was just like, okay, this is fine, The visibility, I think, and the degree to which consequences are happening to us as individuals now around this is so far greater, and it's sad that it took a higher level of consequence for us to take action, but that's very often the case with these types of things, right? And but it does certainly feel now that the privacy debate and how my data is being used could potentially have much higher consequences than it did in the past.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and that's human nature, isn't it? When you're denied an application for a financial product or travel, for example, and you think there's been some mistake, that's a very real practical issue. I think what we then have to do is to start think about those less visible impacts, where individually the impacts are very tiny, but at societal scale they're very serious, and social media is very much at the heart of that. Not just social media. I mean, if we think about the finance and the banking sector, again, some of the algorithms they use are increasingly being automated and trained on data, and it's very easy for us to say, yep, the algorithms seem to work, but
Right.
it's a responsibility on us to make sure that we understand some of the second order or delayed effects,
Certainly.
where over time, it's like boiling a frog, you start to see a bifurcation in fairness or in opportunity or access to services, which you couldn't do in the short term, or looking
Right.
at
Right.
individual cases. You can say, we've tested it on this person and he clearly deserves a bank loan or access to a service, he or she, and we've given it to them, fine. But some of these smaller effects can grow, and so this field will remain interesting for a long time.
Oh yeah. There's two things I want to get into, but I do kind of want to put a bow on this part of the conversation and get your opinion on something. But I want to make sure that we jump into the, you mentioned a lot about what's happening in the government right now in terms of regulation. And I think that you've got a really good pulse on that, that even us in the industry probably don't have a level of understanding that you do. So I want to get into that. And then there's a couple thoughts that I had just around like types of bias that I kind of want to talk about, getting into that as well. But to wrap up some of this beginning conversation, if you had to just define where we are in AI safety maturity, AI ethics maturity, is there a good kind of analogy or way that we can think of, like, where are we? Are we in our infancy? Are we teenagers?
Yeah.
What is the maturity level of the whole AI ethics industry?
Yeah, I think we are teenagers in the sense that we've got some basics understood, and there's consensus around what I call it conceptual clarity. So for some years in information security, it wasn't quite clear why we were implementing security controls or buying security products or following certain practices. But once that clarity happens, you can then say, I am implementing this mechanism or this process in order to achieve this objective. And those objectives were clear and agreed across industry. So, very often you'll hear security broken down into three orthogonal dimensions: confidentiality, integrity, availability, which is often forgotten. And because it's often forgotten, having that framework helps you unforget and make sure that it's covered, or to
Yeah.
have a conscious decision. Because people often, kind of simplify security as just being about privacy,
Right.
and not about some of the other dimensions. We're almost there in terms of this discussion around AI. There's a growing consensus around what it is. And I could give you the views of the UK government or the EU or the US government, but they're broadly crystallizing around the concept of transparency, fairness on individuals, having some sense of a feedback loop where we're recognizing that things aren't perfect, but you're irresponsible if you don't fix things when you know they go wrong,
Yeah.
and so on. So that conceptual clarity is being crystallized, and that's really important. I think where we have some growing up to do is a consensus and a developed practice around who does what the roles and responsibilities are. So those aren't technical. On the technology, we're actually very good. We understand algorithmic bias,
Yep.
bias in the data, shift in data, all these kinds of effects, where we're quite good at those. But as organizations and as people working in those organizations, we're not quite there yet. So we know what a project manager is, we know what a product developer is, we know what a senior risk owner is, but actually we haven't updated their roles and responsibilities in the light of these new kinds of risk. And that will happen. The risk owner will start to understand the new kinds of risks that they have to own and
Yeah.
explain. And everyone in the team, whether it's the product manager or the product owner or the developer or the tester, a new sliver will be added to their the range of activities and
Their
responsibilities
their
that they
job
have.
description gets updated
Exactly.
as, yeah, absolutely. Well
Absolutely.
put.
And the same with governance, which is sometimes seen as a very kind of boring thing to talk about. But very simplistically, if an organization can't respond to risks as they emerge, or even failures, very public failures, then their governance isn't working.
Certainly.
And you can think of it in terms of systems thinking. If you're a creature, you have to have sensors and a
Yeah.
feedback loop that updates. And so in some sense, we know the answer in some sense. And as ever, the challenge is culture change,
Yep.
organizational change.
Yep.
And it was always like that.
Yep.
But as I say, I'm optimistic and quite surprised how much consensus there is around the world. I mean, if Europe was going in a different direction to the US and China was going in a different direction and so on, then we would be looking at, the Microsoft wars, in some sense, the web wars, for another
Certainly.
10, 15 years while we debate this. But that hasn't happened. We are very much in agreement. So I think I'd characterize it as we're still teenagers, but we've got role models and patterns to learn from.
Yeah.
So we are being well brought up as teenagers in some sense.
I love that. That's fantastic. There's just kind of two more things that I wanted to get into. One of them is just kind of this idea of different types of bias, I think, that we can talk about, and there's a direction that I'm heading with this. And then the other big one that I mentioned was just kind of some of the stuff that we are seeing from a regulatory standpoint and how that might impact business. So I'd love to start with that first part of that conversation. So I wanted to bring this up because I think this is such an interesting way to think about bias. And you had said that we know pretty well the bias that's in the technical aspects of things, right? And where that comes from. And I would very much agree for the most part, like during QA or in the data, as because we didn't have enough of it or the data was skewed one way or another. I think back to some of the stuff that was happening with facial recognition software, and obviously a moderately controversial bit of AI itself. But models were developed that substantially underperformed on darker skinned females. And it's very easy to point to why that's happening from a technical aspect. Well, one, they probably had a data set that consisted largely of white males, right? And then they missed it in QA while they're testing the app, because who's testing it? Probably white males who are testing it. So there's definitely an aspect of technical processes that we can just have better versions of for this and think about. And I think we're definitely getting better at that. There's one aspect though that is more complicated, I think, when we talk about AI, and that is not necessarily bias in the data that's damaging, but if there's existing societal bias, the AI can only reflect what exists within society. So if the data, for example, if there is systemic bias in how housing development is done, and that data is captured for mortgage pre-approval, that's not data or technical bias. That's us as a society being reflected in what we built. Much bigger challenge.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
absolutely. And in fact, we see that in policing as well, where some of the systems that have been sold to the police have been trained on a history of police action, and where that has communities that are over policed, or there's bias in that, in effect replays that. So it's a memory system that replays what happened before.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right to say that those questions are at a layer above the kind of the technical discussions around the data and the algorithm development. And this is where organizations need to develop that thinking capability to say, well, what is it that we're developing? what effect is it having? Um, what are the actions that our system has learned? What knowledge has it encoded, and what
Yeah.
is it replaying? And that really that very much falls into the question of ethics. And sometimes the answer is clearly, to resolve those, you couldn't easily have one answer that is valid for every situation. But what I advise organizations is to say, look, sometimes learning from the history of what you've already done isn't right.
Right.
And in fact, it might even be better to develop an automation that actually encodes how you want to behave in future rather than how you used to behave, because that's what everyone does, and we kind of copy without thinking about it.
Right. Right.
And sometimes that means not actually building a machine learning system that learns from data. It might actually be automation that's an expert system or just encodes rules, which is perhaps not as glamorous, but from a business perspective, it's achieving the automation, the efficiencies. And I sometimes have a little phrase that I hope sticks in people's minds. It's build AI for the society you want to be, not the society we were.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it's a bit of an earworm and it sticks with people, but it makes them think about what is it that we're speeding up here? What is it that what mistake are we now making 1,000 times a second? So you're absolutely right to do that. I think this also touches on another area, which is, we kind of talked about it earlier around, it doesn't take a lot to avoid these issues. The questioning of what is it that we're building, and then testing it. Getting an independent view, a third opinion on what we've built. You can see where things have gone wrong before your users do, and that is something that doesn't require sophistication in advanced algorithm. It's just basic testing.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how often that doesn't happen. I go back to the observation that 80-90% of the headlines around AI and machine learning having gone wrong could have been avoided with simple, clear-headed testing.
Yeah.
And having that kind of broadened with a second opinion from somebody who doesn't have a conflict of interest and hasn't been involved in the groupthink. So yes, there are technical reasons why that facial recognition algorithm became biased or very unfair towards parts of our community. But to have spotted that doesn't require a PhD in rocket science.
No, not at all. Yeah.
So in some sense, that's good news. The good news is that you can catch 80-90% of these issues simply by testing, and having a responsive organization that senses and learns from feedback. So that's the good news. 90% of these issues we could have solved, and we already know how to do that with testing, which in some sense isn't glamorous, but is great news if we, in terms of the kind of products and services that we build day to day.
It gives us a nice
but you're absolutely right and you're absolutely right to point out there are different types of bias. Too often I speak to organizations who think bias only originates in the data, and it's a surprise to them that actually the algorithms they use or the models they choose to train, they themselves inherently have a bias as well. Some models like to average the features of users, for example. And that means that they kind of diminish or ignore the diversity or the outliers in their communities. I'm trying to explain it in words that business people can understand. So that's a surprise to them sometimes. And this third category, you're absolutely right to point out, sometimes we are learning systems to replay what we used to do, which we don't want to do.
I do like how you framed that, like instead of, we make mistakes as a society at one speed, but when those are trained into an AI, it's like, let's just accelerate that because it can do it a million times faster.
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
I think back to, it's just a classic case now, but like this discussion is reminding me so much of Microsoft's Tay. If you train an AI chatbot on Twitter streams, you're going to end up with a horrible, racist, evil chatbot because it's reflected in just what the conversation's happening on there. And then, but to your point, like, who at Microsoft like didn't just have a brief conversation with this AI and say, oh, this is bad. We've created a horrible racist chatbot. Someone could have just tested that fairly easily, I think.
I do sometimes think, whether there's a very boring and very mundane issue to be resolved here, where technology companies, even very well-resourced ones, seem to put out untested products. I've just upgraded my operating system and they can't print anymore.
Oh my gosh!
So some of the issues are very sort of basic and mundane. I think there's another issue. Your discussion prompts me to. It reminds me of another factor that is at play, which is, because of the science fiction history around AI, because of the kind of popular culture, and because of the realism with which machines can now act in a very human-like way, it's very easy for us to personify them. It's very easy for us to think about them as beings, as intelligent creatures. And we should avoid doing that. We will always do that just because of our history and culture and art. But we should try to avoid doing that, because what it means is that we lay responsibility or blame at the wrong person. And sometimes we have seen, unfortunately, business leaders, leaders in government, when things have gone wrong, shift the blame to the algorithm. Right. As if it was, or the technology, as if it was something capable of accepting blame. And this distance between, they've tried to create a distance for accountability. In the UK, I think it was last summer with the whole kind of pandemic, we had some challenges in the UK around how do we grade students at the end of the year where they've not been in school and so on. I'm sure it happened in the US as well. And we had an automated system which sounded great, but it behaved really badly, actually. In fact, it did what we talked about. It reinforced previous behaviors. So if you went to a school that traditionally did well, it automatically pushed you up, no matter how. So there was a limit on how well you could do if you went to a less well-performing school, even if you did really well.
And this remarkably bad.
So the politicians call this the mutant algorithm, and that was very clever because it creates a narrative and a story and a picture in people's minds of this monster, this rampaging algorithm that's on the loose, and it points the blame at it then. But actually, we as informed citizens, we should resist that and say, actually, no, somebody created that algorithm. Somebody was in charge of its safety, how well it performed. Somebody is a risk owner. Somebody is accountable in the organization. It is a tool, just like any other tool. It is like a hammer or a knife or a screwdriver or a blowtorch or a road digger. These tools are very useful, but also dangerous in the wrong if used incorrectly. So I think that's an interesting effect, and we will always have leaders and politicians who will try that trick of taking advantage of the personification of AI and say it was Tay's fault or it was the mutant algorithm's fault.
It's not Microsoft's fault. That was all Tay.
Exactly. So that's an interesting thing I've observed, and we need to be kind of wary of that.
I've never quite had that perspective. That's really fascinating. I think you've given me a new way to think about some of these risks as well, right? Like, oh, sorry, it's out of my hands. It's in the algorithm, it is fascinating to think about how we just don't do that in other well-known aspects of our lives. Like If if a car has a, I think back like in the 80s, the Pintos exploding when they got rear-ended, wouldn't be like, oh nope, sorry, it's just the Pinto's fault, not the car manufacturer. It's crazy that we see that happen so much in AI because it's so personified.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think learning from some of these other sectors and drawing parallels is a healthy thing to do.
Yeah.
And medicine is a very good example as well, where sometimes the medicines, the effect of drugs isn't 100% deterministic, but we have found ways of assuring ourselves as a society that we're happy with the way that drugs are tested and the whole process around trials, and somebody is accountable, and there's recourse when things go wrong. So we don't have to reinvent all of that. We can learn from that. Yeah, I think it's sort of, in conclusion, I think AI is really exciting. There's things that we can now do that we couldn't do, and some of those things are genuinely mind-blowing. If you take away the hype, there is a lot of hype. It's very healthy to take away the hype, and then to actually enjoy the real progress that has happened, because it's amazing. For example, the example that we gave earlier, that an AI can develop new game strategies that 3,000 years of human players didn't develop. That's a genuinely new thing. But on the other hand, we should not be. We should try to avoid being kind of hoodwinked into seeing them as something mysterious or a monster.
Yeah,
they're just tools, and somebody designed them. Somebody
it's code
built
and
them.
math.
Exactly. And that's a very healthy thing to do.
Awesome. You've been incredibly generous with your time.